All right, got the red light on. It's the only thing you have to care about when you do these presentations. So my name's Chris. I'm talking about preprocess functions. Does anyone, are you guys familiar with preprocess functions? Use them quite a bit. Cool. So I'm going to be talking about that. If you want my slides, I pinned them on my Twitter. I have some links at the end if you're interested. All right, so we're talking about preprocess all the things because all the things need preprocessed, most of the time. So preprocess functions, we're going to talk about what they do, how to use them, and just some helpful tips and tools that you may need for theming, using Twig, different, mainly the biggest things I found useful for preprocess functions. So this may have been your face at some point if you could not get a class on a div. And you've tried the GUI, you've tried several options. So we're going to talk about that and what to do with those, because we shouldn't be making this face. Our life should be a lot simpler. So what are preprocess functions? Really, they just, modules in core and contrib create and serve up data that gets put on the page. And if you need to change that, if you need to change how it renders, what information is provided, or how it displays on the page, preprocess functions are what you're looking for. The main role of preprocessors is to set up variables in the template, and these variables can contain complex render arrays or simple Boolean values. Most of the logic should be kept in the preprocessors rather than putting all your logic in the templates, just so things are more clean and you don't have people digging through your code trying to figure out where things are. It's just a nice way to have it all together. And this all happens before it hits the page. So if you need to change things before it gets there, they're great. So first things first, debugging is essential for preprocessing and for theming your site. First, if you haven't done this already, if you don't know about this, you probably do. If you go in your services.yaml under sites default in Drupal 8, then you'll see this code. If you don't have a services.yaml, you'll have a default.services YAML. If you recreate that and rename it as services.yaml, then what you'll want to do is under twig config, you can change debug to true instead of false, and that'll give you some neat things I'll show here in a second. And by default, it is set to false. So you will want to change that. Mainly what this does is it prints out theming information, different just information that would be very beneficial for you. So this will now show up theming template suggestions and theme hooks in the comments of your HTML website. And that looks like this. So when you inspect the page, what it'll look like, it'll pop these comments in here, and your theme hook is what you will be calling if you're trying to change or modify this specific thing on your site, and your file name suggestions are just what you'll use the templates for, and you can modify these, change these to be very specific if you need to, which a lot of times you do, and we'll cover that here shortly. Here's another example, just more complex for block views, exposed filter, search page. I've added multiple suggestions to this, and really just to give an example of this. Let's see, here's another one. And the main thing to look here is your theme hook is block, and so in your preprocess function you'll be using that hook to specify, hey, we're changing this block, and you can add more, you can make it more specific based on your needs. So Drupal 7, you would do this all in template.php in your theme. That's not a thing anymore. In Drupal 8, it's just your .theme file. So it'll be mytheme.theme, and all of this, it's still a PHP file. So basically works the exact same, it's just not theme settings, or template.php instead. And like I said, try to keep your logic, your if statements, your loops all of that in here, rather than in Drupal 7 a lot of people would put that in their template, which just gets messy and very hard for new developers joining your project to find where things are. So the function of preprocess, the format of preprocess functions is function, theme name, preprocess, hook. So what the hook is, as I was saying, the theme hook from earlier, block, region, that will be your hook. So you're using this function as that. So a hook is the element you wish to preprocess. Preprocess basic things like nodes, pages, to get more in depth, and preprocess fields, expose filters, forms. You can do it pretty much anything on your site, even small detail input elements you can preprocess and change how they render. And we're going to see, you can use the debugging that we enabled to find the theme hook, which I've used this so many times. So if anyone's used the Better Expose Filters module, it's great. Basically in views, it'll just create better exposed filters. That's the name, it lives up to its name. You can change radio button select list to actual links that go on your page instead of having to style a radio button to look like a link. So that's nice because a lot of designs call for that. So on this, we go to the site, we pull up the inspector on this element, and wrapped here is the theme hook BEF radios. And you may not understand what that is at first, but now we know we're looking for our theme hook. And since this is BEF radios, all we have to do is come back here to our .theme file, write function myTheme, preprocess BEF radios, and then you can modify all the variables that prints out. So any information that gets passed to this thing on your page will you can now modify it and change. So it's very handy if you're trying to find something and figure out how it's being put on the page. Just find out the theme hook and you can print out the variables, which we'll discuss here in a second. Okay, where are we? All right, so viewing variables. There are basically two options. There are several more, but these are probably the best for developers rather than just printing out a PHP echo array or a print-r. So the devel or devel module, that's what we basically, in Drupal 7, that's what we called king because that's the best thing that we could use. They had, I think it was DPM was the function in Drupal 7, and you could DPM the variables and it would print it out in a nice way that you could see is being printed out. However, in Drupal 7, or Drupal 8, which I'm mostly talking about today, they're kind of similar in all of this. But for Drupal 8, the devel functions are kint or KSM, and what you would do is you'd go inside that preprocess function we've created. So the function myTheme preprocess BEF radios, and inside that function you could call kint or KSM variables. That variable actually right here, and you pass that through one of these and it outputs all of the information on the page. I think it's kint actually has a tab where you can select which methods that you can call off of these elements. So it really gives you everything that you could use or need to, let's see, similar to DPM. KSM, it's ugly. They're both ugly, kint and KSM, but they do the work if you need it. If you don't want to set up xDebug. So xDebug is, if you don't use it, you should. There's a great blog that actually Josh right there, he wrote. No, he's my boss, so I have to put a plug in for him. So he wrote a blog. There's a lot of great articles. I think JetBrains did one on how to create or set up xDebug. Basically, with kint, you say like, oh, we want to kint out these variables and it'll print it out on the page. With xDebug, you can actually go in your PHP code, kind of like a JavaScript console, and put breakpoints, and then it'll break and show you all of the variables. So you can step line by line and see what variables are being displayed. So xDebug is fantastic. There's even a little tab where you can switch over to a console and type out your variable, type out a method, and it'll print out what data would be returned. So it's very handy just on the fly trying to figure out what information you need for this. So the Devel module functions, yeah, you would kint your variables, KSM your variables, always clear the cache. You have to, it won't work if you don't. So clear the cache when you go to the page, then you profit, because unless sometimes Drupal's weird and it doesn't print out right away, sometimes you have to down your server and bring it back up and then it works. This is why I like xDebug, because it works most of the time. But yeah, so then you would see something like kint and KSM. You would see something like this. I think this is specifically KSM, prints out like this. Could be either or, they're pretty similar. But so you would get this information. Let's say I just printed out the variables array. And so your elements, that's everything that's inside printed on the page. Your theme hook is node, your attributes, title prefix, suffix. You have all this information in this structure that is generated and put together to theme the page. So as you can see, you can change anything really just to make things exactly how you want it to be. This is the second, this image was maybe this long, so I broke it out. You can even see the user's information who's viewing the page, which view mode you're using. So you could even do specific if statements to say, if you're on a node, view mode full or teaser, only show 2 images. Like, you can change the variables based on these. And then inside, here's the rest of them. And you have your theme hook suggestions, which we'll cover in a second. And your content is actually the information. That's right. So the elements is the elements on the page, and then inside that you can find the content, the actual data that's on the page. Or in just the base variables array, there is content as well, which has the content that's printed on the page, the data, if you will. So this is just another KSM that I did. This is for a Drupal node entity, full view mode theme. So this is your theme hook. So you could specify variables. If theme hook this with teaser, you can get very specific. Let's see what's next. And so here you can kind of see the different things that would be on the page. So you have, this is a field I defined field section, and then if you were to expand that, you'd have the data, maybe some attributes that you have on that. You have your sidebar div or field, you have your title. So you have all this information that you can play around with inside this preprocess function just right off the bat. This is all from just doing a KSM or a kint on the variables inside a preprocess node. So xDebug, which I talked about a little bit, what you would do, you would go inside your .theme file, inside your preprocess function, and you would find a variable or something you do want to stop your code on, and you would add a breakpoint, which is just a little button on the side, and then you start xDebug. Again, if you've never used xDebug, I would highly recommend it. There are articles on how to use it and get really familiar with what it does exactly. After you add the breakpoint, you would clear your cache and then just click Run on xDebug, and it will start a web page and take you to the site and then pop out all the variables that it prints out on the page once it hits that line of code that you've run. And again, you would profit because all the information is there. So xDebug, it's not that crazy. Just take my word, even though I'm not showing you how to do it. All right, so let's say we wanted to add classes to an element or a wrapper, because sometimes when you add a class in Drupal, it doesn't show up, and we don't know why. But we're going to cover this. So if you want to do this, you would do it under variables, classes, array, and that's just an array of different classes that would go on an element. And so you can either print that out and see what there is and change one, remove a class and switch it with another one. You can just add to this array of classes, and that would get printed out on the page. And you will see it as soon as you clear the cache that updates immediately. So here's an example of doing that if we wanted to add classes to an element. So here I'm doing function myTheme preprocess HTML. So this is just pre-processing basically the whole page outside of the body tag, just all of the HTML and pre-processing. And so we don't really have to worry about this, but what this is saying is if there's a user, if their user ID, we grab their user ID, we load that user, and then we use a method called getRoles to get the user role off of the user. And then we're checking down here if administrator is in the array of the roles that this user has. Then we're going to say variables classes array, new key, administrator, and then we just added the class administrator to the body of the page. So then you could say, oh, well, this div should only show up or be styled this way if an admin's viewing it. This is the way that you would do that. Another example, if we wanted to add exposed filter titles to the wrapper classes, we would, let's see, in this example, I am using the theme hook details, so that is just a details element that they use commonly in the exposed filters. And I'm saying if variable element type, so if the input is a radio button or if the input is a checkbox, then I'm going to grab the title because we have that value exposed to us in this variables array. Use Preprocess to strip dashes or strip spaces and make everything lowercase and put dashes in there instead of spaces so it can be a class. And then I just add that here to variables attributes class. And this is a little different than the previous, that was a classes array. And this variables attributes class is a string. So as you see here, you just append this string onto the end of that class. And it will add those classes to the page. Is this all making sense so far? Okay. So if we wanted to set blog taxonomy links to blogs/term name instead of /taxonomy/term name. This is how we would do that. We'd say if variables field name equals field blog tags, then we get the tags, which is variables items, and then variables blog term name. I'm just defining an empty array at this point. And then I'm looping over the tags array, doing a for each here, and let's see. So I'm just grabbing these titles and setting them in the URLs for these paths. So instead of just being /taxonomy term /1, 2, 3, the URL for these taxonomy links will now be /blogs/name, which is handy for some, if you can't figure out, I think it's Path Auto, they do patterns that you can do for your link paths, and sometimes you can't get the right things exposed properly to get titles, or if you want to do like a description field in the link, that probably wouldn't be as easy, so you could just pre-process the field to put the title in the URL instead of doing it through the GUI. And another thing that people will do quite often, this is pretty common with preprocess functions, is adding JavaScript to a block. So let's say you have a slick slider or some kind of flickety slider. Oh, there goes my pointer. And you don't want to add the JavaScript to the whole site, but you just want to add this JavaScript to this block. to be as minimal as possible. What we would do is we would find the preprocess block function, and it doesn't have to be, in this example I did it for every block, but you can specify exactly, oh, I only want to do this on my slider block, and then you can add in the attached library variables, you can add this as a new variable to, you can attach this library to that specific block. So then instead of having crescendo, that was my theme name slick slider, instead of having that JavaScript library running on every page just taking up a lot of bandwidth, you could only put this on a very specific block where it needs to go. So that's probably one of the most common uses for preprocess functions, and it's very useful. So next we're going to talk about render arrays, or as some people call them, renderable arrays. I'm still trying to figure out the right way to say those. But they are better to use than just hard-coding HTML on a block or in a module, because people adding a block to a page, you could, let's back up, sorry. So render arrays, what they are is, it's an array with different attributes and HTML elements. It doesn't have to be HTML, but it has data attached to it and content, and then Drupal will serve that up as HTML or however it goes. So why would you want to do that in your module or your theme rather than just writing HTML in the template? That's because if somebody comes along later, or you contribute this module and you just hard code HTML, another developer that needs to change things will need to find exactly where you hard coded that. Whereas if it was a render array, they could pre-process it and just modify something on your block rather than having to change the actual template. They can just hook into it and change it. So essentially you're writing reusable code, which that's what we're trying to do, just make the internet a better place. So here we're going to talk about creating them, calling and using them in a twig template, and why you would use them. I just covered that. So next. This is a render array. This is what they look like. This is one I created. So you have the variables content array, and inside that I defined this new array called user info. And render arrays usually take this kind of structure. So you tell it what kind of type it is, what kind of type of render array. Oh, this is an HTML tag. So then I can tell it, oh, it's a tag. Well, it's a div. Or you could say it's a header element. I want it to be, they're completely versatile because you can define them and modify them completely as you want to. Then your attributes here, this is where you can add your classes. So this is your attributes class array with your different classes you can attach to it. So as I was saying, a good reason to do render arrays is because people can just hook in and add their own class rather than having to go find the template, hit space, add a class, save it, and leave it for the other guy later on. This is way better for thinking long term for your site, and just it's better. And then here we have, this is another thing with kind of people being able to change how things are dynamically. So I have variables content user info, as we just defined here. And so here I'm adding actual fields and content inside this HTML div that I created in the render array. So you can just go in, now that we've created the div render array, and we can create these arrays inside of user info and then just feed them this content. So instead of just creating a div, we've created an array that you can plug content into however you want to. And it's very easy. It's great for the long term. So next, I'm going to show you, it gets cut up a little bit. So this is actually a screen grab. I grabbed some xDebug screenshots this morning so you can kind of see what that looks like and why it's great. So let's say we loaded up the page. we are on the user page, the user profile page, and I've created a breakpoint in my preprocess user function. So what that's going to do, as soon as the page loads, it's going to print out all this data. So you have up here your variables we've been discussing, elements, your theme hook, which is user, your attributes, title attributes. So it's a lot similar to the KSM or the Kint that I showed previously, only this runs with KSM and Kint. You have to enter the function clear the cache every single time when you if you make a change. With xDebug, xDebug is running while you're looking at this, so you can change and modify things and see how it updates pretty quickly. And what's next? I have another example. So inside elements, you have the user, the view mode, you're on the full user view mode, the pre-render, this is an array of data. Your children would go in here, just data that's inside these variables. And then you can see here we have, these are all the fields I have on my user, and they're all here that you can say, oh, well, if we have this field, I've actually done this before. I've taken field user first name and field user last name, created a variable, combined them, so it was the first and last name, and then saved that as another data attribute for the user. And then you can save both their first and last name separately, but on the site present it as their name, first and last name. So that's handy. You can get their phone number, throw it in there. So next, now xDebug, we can see their value, its value. So now I want to talk about render arrays, how we would call this in Twig. So in Twig, we have, if you have a content type or a node, and everything in your managed display will be printed out, or however you do it, in your view mode, will be printed out under content. So if you just print content, everything in that view mode will be printed. But let's say we have this, let's go back. Okay, so we have content, user info I've defined, so Twig uses dot notation. So if we wanted to print that out, all we say is if there's content.userinfo, content.userinfo. So it's pretty simple to put it on a page in Twig. You can even go in deeper if you want to say .userinfo.field Facebook, like I had there, or put them in different spots on the page. It's pretty easy to find a flow of things. So this is one of my favorite uses for preprocess functions. It's the theming, the template suggestions, or the template naming suggestions. So we all know, like, you have a template, you have a node.yaml, HTML YAML, node.tpl.php. What do I name this page? How do we figure this out? What do we do? So this does it all. Because first of all, with the debug presented, as I showed earlier, there is they already have theming suggestions created by modules like node, entity, things like that. But with preprocess functions, you can add your own template naming suggestions. So you could even say, let's say if you had a node content type called blog, and then you have a taxonomy of food blog, you could add in your template naming suggestion blog-food-html.twig. You can get very specific with them, so let's look that over. These can be used globally, so you can just say any node template should have this word in there. So, or you can be specific, like I was saying. So the format of these functions is hook, theme, suggestions, hook, alter. I know that's a little confusing, but so it's not theme name, it's just hook, which could be your module name or your theme name. Then theme suggestions, hook, which will be your hook theme that you're trying to change, alter. So what that looks like, let's go here. Okay, so I am doing this in my theme. That is my theme name. Believe it or not, it's not. And we're trying to change a container on the page. So the container is the theme hook, and we found that through debug by looking in the comments. This is a container. And so I've first off just created this function name. I use PHP Storm for most of my development. It's very handy because it knows all of the Drupal functions. So it has a lot of autocomplete if you're just start typing out your theme suggestions. Oh, like, do you want this element? And it's very handy for quick development. So inside this, a lot of times people will create a pieces array, and what that does, they'll have variables element type. So that would be like node, entity, content type. And then you have your name, so the actual name of the item or piece of content, and then the display ID. So that could be full, teaser. And what they do is they'll your suggestions array here is what gets presented on the page. So we have suggestions, we create a new key, and then do container underscore underscore, and then we throw all of these in here separated by an underscore. So then you'd have like container node food blog full. And so you can get very specific, and you don't have to use pieces if you just want to say, hey, I want all these templates to have the word dog at the end of it. You can do that. So what the information looks like after you print this out in xDebug. So this is the suggestions. This is what actually gets thrown into the HTML. These are your suggestions you can use for your templates. You have field string, field title, field node homepage, field node title, homepage. So all of these you could throw on a .html, .twig, and use it as a template for that very specific thing. So they're very handy. They're very useful for this. And these are just the array, the variables that you have content exposed under. And as I was saying, you can just be very specific with how you want your suggestions to be. You can throw in your field name, your entity type into your template naming suggestion. Here's just some more variables that I have pulled up. All right, and that's the example I just showed. So in Twig, variables will be called by their associative key. Variables footer, that will just be called footer in Twig. As I said earlier, if it's under content, so variables content, in Twig it would be content.footer. But since we have footer is right underneath variables in the array, then that would just be called footer in Twig. If you throw it inside content footer, you would use content.footer in the Twig template. And you can even use if checks in Twig. So if there is a footer, if there's content in the footer, print it out, which can be very useful. It's just for error checking, so you don't have random stuff on the page when it shouldn't be. Lastly, we have forms you can do. It's not necessarily pre-processing. You can pre-process forms, but modifying forms, they're the main way to do that is through a hook form alter. And so I'm going to discuss how to add a link to a form. And you do need to be careful when you're just adding elements, mainly text fields to forms, because people can hack into those, so you just have to have the right things in place so people can't do those. So this is in xDebug what it looks like when you print out the variables from a form. This is my user login, user registration form. And so you have the name field, the pass field. This is your validate information. The form ID is user login form, and it's type form. And this is all getting printed out through a hook form alter. So it's kind of similar to a preprocess function, only you're just completely changing what the form is going to do. not before it gets to the page, just in general. This form will be completely different if you use a hook form alter. As opposed to a preprocess, it only changes it before it shows up on the page. Here's some more data you would see in xDebug from a form alter. You can get your form ID, you can select the method that you're using, the get request, and then you also have all this stuff under form state, so you can actually see what the user has changed, what process they are in the form, and then you can add submit handlers to save different fields, do different things when people have changed things on the form. So here's an example of a form alter. We have function myTheme form alter, and I usually just copy this from Drupal.org, the variables you pass in here. Or if you have a client that has suggestions, just type it out, it'll autocomplete. So let's say we want to add a sign up link to our user login form. Instead of just adding a field in the GUI, you could do it this way. So I'm saying if our form ID is user login form, which that's why it's useful to have stuff like this, you can just use this variable in your if statement to pull through here. So if you're on the user login form, we're going to create a new array under form called sign up, and inside that I'm just setting the markup is this paragraph with an A tag inside it, and I'm setting the weight to 2 so it doesn't show up right at the top, and that will add a new link to your sign up form or your user login form. So let's say you have a login form, but there's no sign up link. How do they sign up for your site if they don't have an account? You could simply throw this code on your site and you'd have a login form or a sign up link on your form now. Then, yeah, right there, just /user/register. It's where you go for that. So today we've talked about a preprocess, all the things, what preprocess functions do, how to use them, and helpful tools and tips to make your life easier. Remember, if you don't want to spend the time to use xDebug to try to set all that up, you can use the Devil module to do that. The Devil module does have some great things, like there is a way to execute PHP code just for testing through the Devil module. So you could say load node 84, and it'll show you the information right there in the back end in the admin interface. So that's very handy. If you're just trying to see, like, why doesn't my code work, you can throw it in Devil, and it will do that. They have some shortcuts for clearing the cache quickly. That's very nice. Also, yeah, so the Devil module is great. I still recommend using PHP or xDebug, and PHP Storm does have a very good integration with xDebug. I think that's why a lot of people use it. So we have, I have some links on here. If you go to my slides, I tweeted them. Because obviously you don't want to type that down, or you could write it on your notebook. Take a while, but. So now you're the coolest guys in the world, and there's my information if you need it. If you guys have any questions, we're a few minutes early, but not quite. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me in Preprocess All the Things.